Autumn rain tapped softly against the wide glass panels of the 39th floor penthouse, nestled in the heart of Vancouver. In the gray wash of daylight, Elliot Grant, 36, sat motionless in a leather chair by the window, eyes locked on his computer screen. Once a celebrated architect and the visionary behind a global sustainable design empire, Elliot had built cities, won accolades, and shaped skylines. But today, the world he created had turned its back on him. In front of him lay a medical report. Cold, clinical, black and white words cut through his thoughts like a razor. Malignant brain tumor. Inoperable. Estimated time left, 12 to 18 months. His fingers dug into the armrests, veins bulging against pale skin. He made no sound, no cry of anguish. But inside, a tremor cracked the foundation of everything he believed in. Death, something he always thought would arrive later, after he'd done everything right, was now a looming verdict. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being forgotten. A man like him, who designed green cities, who stood on international stages to accept awards, could he really vanish so easily? No wife, no children, no one to remember him once he was gone? Elliot Grant would disappear like he had never been here. He stood, walked to his desk, where an unfinished blueprint lay untouched, edges curling. His voice was barely a whisper as he said to himself, "A child. I need a child. Not for love, not for family, but to leave behind a legacy in flesh and blood. No treatment, no miracle, only power." And Elliot still had plenty of that, enough to buy the one thing he could not create on his own, a woman to carry the final hope of his life. Across the country, in a cramped fifth-floor apartment in Montreal, Clara Monroe, 27, sat by her brother's hospital bed. Her hands, once steady on a violin bow, now trembled as she wiped the sweat from Ben's forehead. He was only 15, his skin pale, lips dry, body frail beneath thin hospital blankets. Ben had a rare blood disorder. A marrow transplant was his only shot. That hope, however, came with a price Clara could no longer afford. She had already sold her violin, her concert dresses, even the dream of one day performing at the Royal Albert Hall. But none of it was enough. And time was slipping away. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Monroe?" a deep male voice said. "I represent Mr. Elliot Grant. We have a proposal that could change your life." Clara frowned. "I don't have time for scams." "This is no scam," he replied calmly. $5 million. Your brother's full medical expenses will be covered up front. In exchange? She froze. Couldn't breathe. In exchange for what? "Mr. Grant wants a surrogate," he said flatly. "You will carry his child. Once delivered, you relinquish all rights. No contact. This is purely contractual." Clara gripped the phone tighter. She wanted to scream, to curse this man, but Ben's face flickered before her, his tired eyes, his brave little smile despite the pain. Her heart clenched. "Give me 24 hours, she whispered. "No more than that," he said, then hung up. The next day, Clara stepped into the icy conference room at Grant & Associates. The air was sterile, empty. Elliot Grant sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, eyes unreadable. He pushed a folder toward her. "Read it. You'll live in my estate, carry the child, deliver. I'll pay. No attachments, no claims, no future involvement." Clara skimmed the pages. Each clause sliced into her dignity like paper-thin knives. But then she saw Ben's face again, the brother she loved more than anything, her only family left. She looked up, voice shaking yet firm. "I'll sign, but I'm not a baby machine." Elliot's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're a clause, a contract. Don't expect anything else." Clara picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled. When she signed her name, it felt like a piece of her soul broke free and vanished. Elliot Grant's estate sat quietly on the western hills of Vancouver, surrounded by towering pine trees that stood like natural sentinels. From a distance, the glass and steel structure resembled a modern palace, reflecting the somber gray skies of early winter. But as Clara Monroe stepped through the heavy iron gates, what wrapped around her wasn't awe, it was suffocation. Her suitcase held only a few old clothes and a wooden box filled with sheet music. Fragments of a life once filled with music and dreams. The housekeeper, Mrs. Evelyn, a stern woman in her early 50s, greeted her with a tight-lipped expression. "Your room is on the second floor. These are Mr. Grant's house rules." Clara took the neatly typed paper and read, "Do not enter the third floor. Do not ask about Mr. Grant's personal affairs. Only appear when summoned. No noise, no disturbance." Each line felt like another chain being fastened around her throat. Clara nodded. "Understood," she said, voice quiet but firm. Her room was lavish but lifeless. No flowers, no art, just walls as white and blank as silence itself. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The house felt too foreign, too cold. Her chest ached with weight she couldn't name. Drawn by instinct, she wandered to the living room. In the center stood a lone violin, old, untouched, as if it had escaped the purge of everything else new in the house. She lifted it gently, took a deep breath, and began to play a melody she had written for Ben. The notes floated, trembling yet soft, like memories whispered in the dark. Upstairs, Elliot stepped out of his study and froze. That sound, too real, too raw, it cracked open something in him he'd locked away for years. His chest tightened. He descended halfway down the stairs and saw Clara, brown hair cascading over her shoulders, arms wrapped around the violin as if it were breathing with her. "Miss Monroe," his voice cut through the music like a blade. Clara jumped, the notes halting in midair. "No sound is allowed in this house unless I say so," he said, each word rejecting her presence. Clara clutched the violin, eyes misty but gaze unyielding. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I won't play again." Elliot said nothing, turned and walked away, but in that flicker of eye contact, Clara saw it. Not just coldness, but pain buried too deep for words. 5 days had passed since Clara Monroe entered Elliot Grant's mansion. She had grown used to the stillness, the endless white hallways, the soundless marble floors, the ever-watchful gaze of Mrs. Evelyn. But what she couldn't grow used to was the aching loneliness that crept into her chest like cold air through cracks in a wall. Every morning, Clara called Ben. His voice, fragile but bright, pulled her back from the edge. "I drew a violin today," he chirped. "I'll show you tomorrow." That sentence became her anchor. That afternoon, while aimlessly exploring the mansion, Clara found herself at the foot of the forbidden staircase leading to the third floor. A door stood at the end of the hallway, old wood, slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Curiosity overtook obedience. She stepped inside. It was a small, dust-covered room, silent as memory. On a table sat a faded photo of a woman with warm eyes, holding a cello in her arms. An unfinished oil painting leaned against the window. A sunlit garden mid-bloom. In the corner, a wooden box overflowed with handwritten letters. Clara picked one up. The script was firm, emotional. "I once thought the world was ours, but perhaps fate chose otherwise." No name, but each word ached with sorrow. She stood there, still. The cold man she saw every day, he had once loved and lost. The woman in the photo reminded Clara of her own mother, who used to lull her and Ben to sleep with violin songs. "Used to be someone else," Clara whispered. That evening, at the long, silent dining table, Elliot sat with his tablet, barely eating. Clara sat across from him, fingers twisting her napkin. Then, quietly, she spoke. "I found a room on the third floor," she said, soft but steady. "There was a photo. Who was the woman?" The air froze. Elliot looked up, and his eyes flashed with fury. "You had no right to dig through my life," he snapped. "You're a surrogate, nothing more." His words cut deep, but Clara held his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said calmly, though her heart raced. "I just thought maybe you needed someone to listen." Elliot stood abruptly and walked out without another word. But Clara didn't regret what she'd said, because in his eyes, just for a second, she had seen pain. Real, unhealed pain. The medical suite inside Elliot Grant's mansion was sterile, quiet, and cold, just like the rest of the house. Clara Monroe sat on the edge of the exam bed, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the white tile floor. Today was the day she fulfilled her side of the contract. Elliot's private physician, a composed middle-aged man with quiet eyes, entered with 2 nurses. Everything happened quickly, efficiently, and without unnecessary words. Clara never once looked up during the embryo transfer procedure. No comforting touch, no gentle question, not even a "Are you okay?" She was a body selected for genetic compatibility, good health, and a signature scrawled in trembled ink. When the nurse told her to rest for 30 minutes, Clara lay back and stared at the white ceiling, listening to the low hum of the ventilation system. Her heart no longer belonged solely to herself. It was now the beginning of something sacred and binding. Elliot didn't appear that day, not even a message, not even a glance. But Clara wasn't surprised. She hadn't expected anything from a man who had looked her in the eye and said she was a clause. Still, beneath her resigned calm, something in her felt hollow. Not because of Elliot, but because the experience, this monumental, life-changing moment, had been stripped of its intimacy. For most, pregnancy was a miracle. For her, it was a transaction, a beginning calculated in numbers, sealed in ink and bound in silence. Yet when she placed her hand gently on her stomach, still empty but now seeded with the possibility of life, tears slipped from her eyes. "No matter how you came to me, I'll protect you," she whispered. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the rain fall gently onto the rose bushes below. Her hand rested over her belly, silently willing life to take root. And somewhere in that vast, quiet house, Elliot was also awake. He wasn't looking at blueprints. He wasn't sipping his usual glass of scotch. He was just sitting still, listening to the rain. He didn't believe in feelings, but he knew something had begun. That morning, soft rain fell over Vancouver. Clara Monroe had just ended her daily call with Ben, her heart lighter after hearing about his latest painting session at the hospital. As she lowered the phone, a knock came at her door. Mrs. Evelyn stood there, her usual stern face oddly softened. "Mr. Grant wants you to see the private doctor today. Prenatal checkup." Clara nodded, her heartbeat stammering. In the bright examination room, she lay still on the ultrasound table as the doctor studied the monitor. Then he smiled. "Congratulations, Ms. Monroe. You're carrying twins. Both babies look very healthy." Clara froze. Her breath caught. Twins? 2 small lives growing within her, growing inside a world of silence, distance, and detachment. She laid a hand over her belly and whispered, "I'll try my best." "For both of you." When she returned to the mansion, Elliot was standing in the living room, his back to her, staring out into the rainy garden. The old violin still sat near the corner, but beside it now rested a fresh stack of sheet music, handwritten. "Is something wrong?" he asked, not cold, but guarded. Clara inhaled. "I just had the ultrasound. It's twins. Both are healthy." Elliot turned around, face unreadable. "Good. Stick to the contract then." Clara looked down, biting the sting of disappointment that pricked her chest, but then her eyes caught the manuscript. On the cover were 5 simple words, "Lullaby for 2 lights." "I wrote it for the kids," Elliot said, voice lower than usual. Clara picked it up, fingers trembling. The notes weren't complex, but they were full of warmth, soft, real. A part of him quietly offered, "May I play it?" He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he nodded once. "If you want." Clara sat down, cradling the violin. She played, slowly, carefully, each note like a whispered blessing for the two lives inside her, and maybe for the man sitting behind her, no longer turning away. Elliot didn't leave. He stayed through every note, unmoving, and when Clara turned to look at him at the very end, she saw something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not ice, but a flicker of awakening. Ever since the lullaby had filled the living room, something had shifted. Not in words, Elliot Grant remained reserved, composed, and emotionally distant. But Clara could feel it. Subtle things. A glance that lingered longer, the space between them narrowing slowly, as though even silence now carried warmth. One morning, with rare sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows, Clara turned to him and smiled softly. "Today we're cooking together." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "I don't know how." "Then learn," she said, placing a carrot and knife on the counter before him. The kitchen echoed with the uneven rhythm of his clumsy cuts and Clara's gentle laughter. She took his hand in hers, guiding his movements. Her fingers brushed his. Warm, gentle. He froze for a moment, caught off guard by the unfamiliar sensation, but for once, he didn't pull away. The spaghetti wasn't perfect, but when they sat to eat, Elliot murmured, "Better than any restaurant." Clara smiled. She didn't reply, only watched him in quiet awe, as if trying to memorize the lightness of the moment. After that day, they went together to a prenatal appointment. Side by side in the exam room, they watched the monitor as two tiny heartbeats flickered to life. Neither of them spoke, but when Elliot reached over and gently squeezed Clara's hand, she felt it. This was real. On the way home, they stopped at a small baby boutique. Elliot picked out 2 pale blue onesies and a pair of tiny booties. "They'll wear these, right?" he asked, almost shyly. Clara nodded, her smile masking the ache behind it. She didn't know if he'd be there when that day came, but today she wanted to believe. In the days that followed, they worked on the nursery together. They painted the walls sky blue, pressed glow-in-the-dark stars to the ceiling, and assembled the crib side by side. When Elliot dropped a screw, Clara burst into laughter. He mock-glared at her, picked up a bit of dried paint, and tossed it at her playfully. "Since when are you allowed to laugh at me?" he teased, voice lighter than she'd ever heard it. Laughter echoed through a house that once knew only silence. Later, they collapsed on the floor, backs against the wall, breathless. Clara looked at Elliot, sweat on his brow, an unfinished smile on his lips, and thought, if I could freeze this moment, then maybe all the pain has been worth it. Elliot's private doctor called early that morning, requesting both of them to come in to review the latest test results. Clara felt a ripple of anxiety, but Elliot simply nodded, silent. On the ride to the clinic, neither of them spoke. His hand lay still on his lap until the car stopped and Clara reached for it. He didn't pull away. In the bright consultation room, Elliot sat upright, Clara by his side. The doctor looked at them with unreadable eyes, then spoke slowly. "The tumor's growth has slowed, significantly, unexpectedly. And there's something else. A surgical team from the US reached out to me. There's a new experimental technique. High risk, but there's a real chance." Clara stopped breathing. Elliot didn't blink. "You mean I could live?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No promises. But this is the best hope we've had." Clara covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Elliot sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the words. As they left the clinic, he reached for her hand, not out of duty, but out of need. They didn't drive home right away. Instead, they stopped in the garden behind the mansion. The morning rain had passed, and sunlight broke over the white chrysanthemums. Clara pulled him down beside her on the grass. They sat in silence, side by side. In Elliot's eyes, for the first time, she saw something soft. A dream. "I want to see them grow," he said quietly. "I want to raise them with you. I want to live." Clara smiled, tears still drying on her cheeks. But fate wasn't finished testing them. The next morning, Elliot returned to his firm for a board meeting. Before leaving, he pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead, now a familiar ritual. Clara brewed him herbal tea, then had a spontaneous idea: bring it to him as a surprise. When she arrived at the office, the receptionist waved her through, but just before reaching his door, Clara stopped cold. Inside, a tall blonde woman leaned over Elliot, arms around his shoulders. Her voice was soft, intimate. "Elliot, I know I made a mistake, but I want to come back. I still love you." It was Madeline, his ex. And Elliot didn't push her away right away. Then came his words: "Clara is just part of a contract. It's nothing binding." Clara didn't hear what came after. She had already turned, walking away, her heart shattering with every step. The afternoon rain poured relentlessly over the narrow road leading to a quiet suburb outside Vancouver. Clara Monroe sat in a dimly lit room of a small roadside inn, staring at the peeling wallpaper, her chest burning with silent grief. It had been 3 days since she walked out of Elliot's office. No messages, no calls. She had vanished, retreating into the echo chamber of her pain. The silver bracelet he once gave her, engraved with "We Walk Together," now lay untouched in a drawer. Every time she glanced at it, her heart clenched. She didn't blame him for having a past. She didn't hate Madeline, but those words, just part of a contract, cut her open in a way nothing ever had. She had believed he felt something. She had begun to dream. She had begun to love him. That afternoon, the rain grew heavier. Clara couldn't bear the suffocating air anymore. She pulled on a thin coat and stepped outside, walking slowly along the muddy roadside, one hand resting over her belly. Every step hurt. Then came the pain. A sharp, searing jolt tore through her abdomen. Clara froze. Her hand clutched the railing beside the road. Another wave hit, stronger. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the wet ground. "No, please," she gasped, rain mixing with tears. An elderly flower vendor nearby saw her fall and rushed over. "Miss, are you okay?" Clara opened her eyes, panic swimming in them. "Please, call Elliot Grant. His number is—" The man didn't hesitate. Back at the mansion, Elliot sat in his study, turning the bracelet over in his hands. The empty silence around him rang louder than any words. He didn't need to be told Clara was gone. He felt it. In the stillness of the house, in the hollow in his chest. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when he stepped out of his office, that the truth hit him harder than he'd anticipated. His assistant looked up nervously. "Mr. Grant? Miss Monroe stopped by earlier. She had some tea for you, but she didn't stay long." Elliot froze. His gaze snapped to the still ajar conference room door. He walked in slowly, and when he saw the untouched cup of tea sitting on the desk, it all came together. She had heard. She had been there, standing behind the door. When Madeline clung to him, when, out of reflex and fear, he uttered the cruelest words he could have said, not because he meant them, but because he thought pushing Madeline away required pretending Clara didn't matter. But it was Clara who walked away, and she took his heart with her. He should have chased after Clara the second she left, but he had done nothing, and now it might be too late. Then his phone rang. A frantic voice. "Mr. Grant? A pregnant woman collapsed near Maple Road. She asked for you." Elliot froze for only a heartbeat. Then he grabbed his keys and rushed out. The rain blurred the road, but he didn't slow down. When he found Clara curled on the ground, soaked to the bone, something inside him shattered. "Clara!" he cried, dropping beside her. "Hold on, please. Don't leave me now." An hour passed. Then the doctor emerged. "She delivered early," he said. "Twin boys. They're in NICU but stable. She lost a lot of blood, but she'll be okay." Elliot collapsed into the nearest chair. Relief hit him like a wave, violent and humbling. Later, he was allowed into the recovery room. Clara lay pale and still, her hand resting over her belly as if still protecting what she nearly lost. He sat beside her, took her hand gently into his. Her eyes opened slowly, tired, clouded, alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You were never just a part of a contract. You're the one thing I couldn't buy. and the only thing I'm truly afraid of losing." She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply held his hand tighter. And in that silence, amid all the heartbreak and rain, two hearts finally found their rhythm again. No words, just the beat. 1 year later, London shimmered under warm golden lights. Inside the Royal Albert Hall, the audience held their breath as the first notes floated into the darkness. Clara Munro sat center stage, wearing a pale blue evening gown that framed her delicate figure. Her chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders. In her hands was her old violin, the same one she once thought she'd lost forever. Tonight, it returned with her, as if memory itself had come home. She drew a long breath and began to play a second breath. The music soared, gentle as wind drifting through memory. Each note was a piece of Clara's journey, from despair to hope, from loss to love. Every phrase whispered, "I lived, I loved, I forgave." In the front row, Elliot Grant sat with their 1-year-old twins in his lap. The three of them watched Clara in silence, eyes fixed on the woman who had changed everything. Then the final note faded. The hall erupted in applause. But Clara didn't stand. Instead, she looked down at the front row, where Elliot had risen and was walking slowly toward the stage. He wore a simple suit, his hands holding a small velvet box. When he reached her, Elliot knelt. "Clara Munro," he said, voice trembling slightly. "You gave me what I could never buy: life, trust, and love. Would you let me walk beside you for the rest of your life?" The hall fell completely still. Clara raised a hand to her mouth, eyes shining with tears. Then she nodded, whispering, "Yes." Applause broke again, this time not for music but for love, for rebirth, for a journey that had reached the edge of sorrow and found its way back to light. Under the glow of the stage, Clara and Elliot embraced. Behind them, the music had ended. But ahead of them, a new chapter had just begun, and, like all true symphonies, theirs needed time, years of quiet rhythms, of small days stitched together in love. 3 years later, their small cottage by Lake Okanagan glowed in the afternoon sun. Children's laughter rang through the garden, where the twins chased after a white dog named Melody. In the kitchen, Clara Munro sliced fruit for dinner, occasionally glancing out the window. Each time the kids dashed past, she smiled. Peace had never felt so simple or so deep. Elliot Grant stepped in from the backyard, clothes dusty, holding a small bundle of lavender still rooted in soil. He set it on the table. "For the bedroom. This scent helps you sleep." Clara looked at him, eyes full of quiet love. 3 years ago, he had laid on an operating table with a 50/50 chance. He fought, not just to survive, but to become a man who stayed. He was healthy now, but more than that, he had learned to stay, not out of fear, but love. Every day he chose them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the family sat together. Clara played her violin. Elliot read aloud to the children. No promises, no diamonds, just heartbeats, breath, and presence. Life wasn't perfect, but they had walked through the storm and reached each other. And that was enough.